introduce yourself to everybody, man. What is the nerd origin story of Bumpkins TV?
Oh man. So, I don't know that I guess every time I talk about this, I just talk about how there wasn't anything that necessarily started it other than I'm a kid of the 80s, and everybody was a nerd back then. That was like the best decade for toys and cartoons and all that stuff. And so I was into all that stuff just like every other kid back in the 80s was. It's just I never stopped, right? So I mean that every like I said, everybody got started with that stuff in the 80s, but as some kids grew up, they sort of fell out of it and moved on, and I just never grew up, so I'm still that same kid from the 80s just trapped in the body of a 40 something year old, and I just never let it go.
Well, and I think that's with a lot of people, like it's I try to explain people, comic book fans and nerds in general, we are just grown adults that
Yeah,
literally never grew out of our stuff that we were into as kids.
right. Yeah. Yeah, and I guess probably the opposite for me. Like I got even more into it, right? So,
Right, same
I
here,
just
yeah,
I just never
especially after
I
the
grabbed on
pandemic.
tighter. Yeah, I just started holding on tighter instead of letting go, and it was.
So
I
what
mean,
was,
I
like, the
don't.
first things you can remember getting into as a kid? Like, was it Ninja Turtles? Was it I
Gosh, it
guess
was
you're a
probably.
bit about a little bit older than I am, so I guess
Yeah,
your
probably
stuff.
like He-Man and yeah,
Okay.
Ninja Turtle was like later 80s, but like He-Man, Transformers, GoBots, GI Joe, DC and Marvel with like the Secret Wars figures and the Superpowers figures. Those were some of my favorites, and of course Lego.
Oh
Um,
gosh, yes, Lego's
I
the
was trying to
best.
think of, yeah, I mean, all of course back then anything was a toy, right? Like they turned in, or they turned Knight Rider into toys. So I had some of that stuff, and like every kind of show like that. So just everything. But yeah, as far as like nerd stuff now, Transformers and He-Man and Lego and yeah, Marvel and DC stuff probably most.
What Lego's interesting because that's one I hear almost everybody mention. Like, what is it about Lego that keeps us hooked even as adults, you think?
Well, now, I like just seeing a big pile of nothing turn into something. But when I was a kid, I was actually pretty creative back then, and I had just huge like Tupperware bins full of pieces, and I would just for hours and hours and days like build my own thing, whatever I could come in, whatever would pop into my head. I would just love to create something out of nothing. Nowadays, it's like I don't really have that creative spark anymore,
Mhm.
but I do like to follow the instructions and like, oh, there's this cool thing that I'm gonna build, but right now it's just a big mess of stuff, and one piece at a time, it get you shape and mold it, and but once it's built, it's like, okay, well, I'm gonna set that over there now and go do something else,
Right.
Whereas as a kid, I was like, yeah, I'm gonna build a thing, but then I'm gonna play with it. Now it's a little bit the opposite, but it's just that creative process I just like.
Alright, so off of Lego, since we are a comic book podcast, what was your introduction into comic books, you think, specifically?
Probably, the it was a combination of my mom would just, that was back in the days where you could go to the grocery store or the drugstore and just like pick a comic book, any random comic off the spinner rack. My dad also owned a convenience store for a lot of years growing up, and it had a spinner rack in it, so I would grab comics off of that. But so it was a combination of just like my parents just grabbing a comic book for me to read, and then like I said, the Secret Wars and Superpowers figures, like the Secret Wars Spider-Man figure, which I still have it. I think it's up in my library upstairs. That's what started my love for Spider-Man that persists to this day. But yeah, just probably a combination of those two things, just comics and toys, and the cartoons too. The Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends and the Incredible Hulk cartoon, and the when I was a kid, I was a little bit later than the Super Friends. Like by the time I started watching this stuff, it had morphed into the Galactic Guardians. I think it was a
Okay.
Challenge of the Super Friends Galactic Guardians cartoon. That was probably my first introduction to DC stuff. Was that cartoon? I was like, oh,
Because
Superman and
Super
Batman and
Friends was the one with the Wonder Twins, right?
that was one, a couple. That was, see, it went through a bunch of different iterations. Like when it first started in the '70s, it was Superman and Batman and Aquaman and Wonder Woman and all those guys. Later on, they did pick up the Wonder Twins for a couple seasons that had Wendy and Marvin and Gleek. But then towards the later couple seasons, it was the Galactic Guardians, and it was a little bit more serious. You didn't have any of the goofy sidekick characters, and that's what inspired the Superpowers toys, which I had a bunch of. So just all of that stuff rolled into a ball, just kind of got it kicked off for me.
That's awesome, dude. Because like, that's, like, a generation before me, but I
Yeah.
can remember seeing a lot of those cartoons on, like, Toonami late at night or something on
Yeah.
Cartoon Network. They would play, like, reruns, and then Boomerang became a thing.
Yeah.
So that was always like, "Okay, so all these heroes are from comic books, but they're also in these cartoons." And, like, as a kid, I was trying to put 2 and 2 together, like, which came first,
Right.
because there wasn't the information available back
Oh,
then.
sure.
Because this was, like, late '90s, early 2000s, so the internet
Yeah.
was still becoming a bigger thing.
Yeah. Yeah, back then, like, trying to figure out anything about anybody, we didn't have the internet, so it's like, who are these people, and
You either had
how
to
do I
know
how do I
somebody
find
at a
out?
comic book
Yeah.
store or get lucky and find something in an encyclopedia somewhere.
Yeah. I don't even really kind of remember how it's almost just like as like with comic books, especially like as I started reading them more and more, it just like the information just was there over time, but I had to
Right.
learn it from somewhere, but I don't know from where, just reading back issues and stuff like that and trying to piece things together.
Yeah,
Nowadays, it's just like, oh, Wikipedia, read, read, read. Oh, now I know everything. But back then it's like
right, because even
it
in the
was
early days of, like, YouTube, like,
hmm
people forget, that was mostly music videos and cat
yeah.
videos back then.
Right.
So so
Yeah.
you weren't really getting any kind of, like, education or anything like that from YouTube or social media, or I mean, social media wasn't a thing yet, so
Yeah. Yeah, it was, but it was fun though, right? Like that discovery process is really fun. And now,
Mhm.
I mean, nowadays you can still do it because it's like you can go down a Wikipedia rabbit hole and try to learn stuff. But like the slow but steady learning of stuff, that was and continues to be really fun. There's still a whole bunch of stuff I don't know, and it's fun to learn, new things and try to learn histories of characters and stories that you never read and that kind of thing. So it's all I enjoy that kind of stuff.
Oh, yeah, because people will be like, because you and me, we make comic book content on
hmm
TikTok and YouTube and everything, and one of the most common questions we all get is, "Where do I start with?" Or, "What's the best run for whatever character?" And it's like, "Well, dude, you're talking about a character with 80 years of
Yeah.
backstory." Like, I haven't
Yeah.
even read everything for that character.
Yeah. And every time I make a video like that where I try to like recommend a book or a character or like best story or whatever, I always feel like I have to qualify it by saying these aren't the only ones. These are just some, but like cuz I always don't I just get paranoid that people are going to think that I'm saying the definitive starting point is right here, but there is no right or wrong way to do it. I always feel like saying I have to say, put that little caveat in there that says there's a whole bunch of great stories. There's a whole bunch of great starting points, but I'm only just giving you a couple because I also don't like to overwhelm people by saying, "Oh, you need to read
Right.
this and read this and read this," and because people's head spin. So I always like to just maybe give two, maybe three recommendations tops, and then just say, just start with one of those, and then you'll figure it out.
Yeah, because I see some people like, "Well, grab this collected edition. It's got this run, this run, this run, this run, and
Mm,
this run." I'm like, "Dude, those are daunting to new people,
yeah,
especially, like, they're expensive too. Like, those omnibuses and collected editions are not cheap."
yeah,
And for
yeah.
somebody
Plus,
first getting into it, it's like you
oh my
wanna give them
gosh,
something that's like an affordable option.
yeah, and it drives me crazy when people say, "Oh, you want to start with X-Men? Well, you've definitely got to start with, Chris Claremont's run on X-Men, or you've definitely got to read Jeff Johns' Green Lantern, or like, no, be specific. Like I like to say, here's the cover, here's what it looks like, here's what it looks like on Amazon, or you can read it digital. Read this is the first 32 issues, and here's what the cover looks like. But I like to be super specific because telling, oh, you need to read Mark Wade's run on Flash. Well, even me, like I don't know what Mark Wade's run on Flash is. I have to go look and see, okay, what issues are
Mhm.
those, and then where are those collected?
Well, and
No,
some of
like
those
be
guys have
specific.
multiple runs on each character they work on
Yeah.
too. So you're
Yeah,
saying
so
Mark Waid's run on Flash, is it like, are there 4? Are there 5? Are there
yeah.
1? I mean, you gotta be really specific with people.
Yeah, so I like to show the book. Like, here's the book. Get this book right here. Don't worry about like what numbers it is or who's the writer yet. Just get this book and read it and see what you think. So
Right.
I try to be as specific as possible.
'Cause yeah, that's another thing is everybody wants to shoot out author names or artist names, and it's like, dude, a new reader's not gonna know who you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
Even
Yeah.
veteran readers, some of us don't even know what these people look like.
Mhm.
We just see names on a cover. I mean,
Yeah, and I'm more attuned to that nowadays, but even with as many comics as I read, like, back in the '90s, I didn't really like, I knew who some of the artists were, but I wasn't really paying attention to the writers, so, like,
mhm,
I've read probably the majority of Spider-Man comics, that not all of them, but the majority of Spider-Man comics that have ever been published. But, all the ones from back then, like, I couldn't tell you who wrote what because I wasn't paying attention to that stuff when I was a kid, and haven't bothered to go back and learn. So, I just, yeah, I don't want to bother people with the details of that stuff. I just like to point at actual physical books and say, go get this one. Here, order it on Amazon, order it on wherever, or read digital. If you're gonna, and I always try to tell people, if you're gonna read it digitally, it's flash number whatever
mhm.
from 2003. Like, give the year, like, just make it as easy as possible to direct them, and just to get their foot in the door, and people will figure it out after that.
Oh, yeah, because I mean, you start trying to figure out authors in this and you're hunting down specific stuff, some of that stuff's hard to find, first
Yeah,
of all. Secondly, it's like, just because you like one thing from a writer doesn't mean you're gonna like everything from that writer. So don't
yeah,
like, hyper focus on an author. Instead of read a bunch of stuff and then pick the ones you really, really liked, and then you go through those authors and see what else they've done.
yeah, yeah, definitely.